Okay, so without any further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ian Dalton, who's a visiting research fellow at the Centre for Contemporary Irish History, Trinity College, Dublin. And Ian is going to be speaking to us today about building citizenship in an alien state, the Protestant search for place and loyalty in post-independence Ireland. So I will stop sharing, Ian, and pass over to you.
Grand, thank you. Can everybody see and hear me? Good. Okay. It's very nice to be here, but it would be nicer if we could gather together in person next year. So here's hoping. This talk is entitled Building Citizenship in an Alien State, the Protestant Search for Place and Loyalty in Post-Independence Ireland. So in December 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which ended the Irish War of Independence, catapulted Protestants in Southern Ireland, almost all British loyalists, then about 7% of the population, into a new political entity, the Irish Free State. In contrarian Protestant essayist Hubert Butler's telling phrase, these Southern Protestants had suddenly become nobody's children. Much of the historiography and a wider literature has presented this as profoundly negative, the ineluctable end of something, which it was, of course. But it also marked the start of an intriguing triangulation between Britain, Ireland, and their indigenous selves, wherein to survive, they had to find and map new forms of citizenship and identity. Southern Irish Protestants sought structures that would speak to a natural human desire to belong, which gelled with the maintenance of their relatively privileged position within Southern society, and which would provide anchoring to the historic beliefs and predilections that had hitherto defined them. This talk is conceptually rooted in a 2011 presidential paper by Evelyn Nakano-Glenn to the American Sociological Association. Glenn's approach, the idea of citizenship as fundamentally a matter of belonging, including recognition by other members of the community, resonates with the ambiguities and rootlessness of the Protestant condition after independence. Glenn has a striking metaphor for this by reference to the Southern United States. She writes, segregation of streetcars meant that whites rode in the front and blacks in the rear. Often, however, there was no fixed physical line. Instead, the lines demarking the white section were established by how far back whites chose to sit. This was precisely the dilemma facing many Southern Protestants in the New Ireland. Would they be on a genuine omnibus with no boundaries, or would lines be drawn by the majority? Boarding and remaining on the bus was relatively easy. A bargain may have been struck. In return for an outward acceptance of the constitutional dispensation, Protestants had expiated their former sins. The responsibility for Irish history was no longer theirs to bear. In addition, an elaborate choreography may have been in play on both sides, avoiding confrontation where possible. In significant respects, this innately conservative and relatively prosperous people found it not too difficult to go with the Irish Free State's flow. For tax-paying Protestants, the state turned out to be fiscally orthodox. It was a guarantor of order. Like many Catholics, Protestants were condemnatory of socialism and suspicious of statism. The state's cultural conservatism suited the majority, who didn't necessarily want to divorce, limit their family's size by artificial means, or expose their servants to licentious literature. For its part, the state, fearful that Protestant banks and big firms like Guinness would up sticks, wrapped their minority in cotton wool and largely kept its nose out of the Protestant world. It helped that Irish society was quite homogenous, with few linguistic and ethnic barriers, even if a narcissism of small differences existed in the religious sphere. In this, Protestants were unlike other minority communities elsewhere in Europe after the Great War, such as the Germans in Estonia, Latvia, and Prussian Poland. Contracting out of the state apparatus entirely, as Estonia allowed its minority German population to do in the field of education in the early 1920s, was never really a serious option. And irredentism had no purchase or no point. Unlike Nakano-Glenn's blacks in the southern US, and indeed much different from the Northern Irish, especially Belfast Protestant loyalism, Southern Protestants formed a relatively prosperous community. But as their neighbours and customers were largely Catholic, it was politic to declare public loyalty to the new dispensation from time to time. But this should not be taken entirely at face value. A leader of Southern Anglicanism, Archbishop Gregg of Dublin, may publicly have offered, quote, our loyalty and our goodwill to the new state, but privately he felt banished from the Garden of Eden. Yet if Protestantism may have felt that the loyalty and goodwill expressed by Gregg and others gave it a license to lay into distasteful orthodoxies of the new state, it had to be careful. As Senator Sir John Keane put it in 1932, when the tiger is placed in proximity with the lamb, the tiger, not menaced, may well be indulgent, and the lamb, he has no alternative but to lay low and hope he is unnoticed. Provocative public acts like the flying of the Union flag over Trinity College until 1945, the ostentatious wearing of poppies and singing God Save the King at the Dublin Horse Show only provided unwelcome attention and even occasional violence. Mavericks were not really encouraged, summed up in Dean Victor Griffin's faux horrified reaction to Hubert Butler, God, he'll get us into trouble. W.B. Yeats's 1925 Senate speech on the outlawing of divorce was a powerful cry for the recognition of the Protestant contribution to Ireland's national life, but its aggressive and superior tone alienated many Protestants who felt that the best policy was, whatever you say nothing. Those who did open their mouths sometimes exhibited tongue deafness. In 1932, the Church of Ireland determined to show, in Archbishop Gregg's sincere but easily mocked claim that the Church of Ireland was, quote, the most Irish thing there is in Ireland, by ostentatiously celebrating the 1500th anniversary of St. Patrick's reputed landing in Ireland. In a heady bubble of dubious ecclesiastical history, the Church skated over the inconveniences of conquest, plantation, and penal laws, and asserted its pre-Reformation credentials, retrofitting St. Patrick into Irish history as a sort of proto-Protestant. That really was never going to fly. In Ed West's classification, if Southern Protestants could be seen as cosmopolitan parochials, perhaps this encouraged them to seek a form of citizenship in places where votes did not actually count. In the more moral sphere, for instance, they could avoid the majoritarianism of democracy in post-independent Ireland and legitimize a challenge to those attributes and actions of the new state that Protestants fell short. Archbishop Gregg's vision was that the Irish Anglicans should, quote, serve the highest interests of the nation and uplift its standards of character and conduct. The Reverend Bolton Waller encouraged Protestants, quote, as Irish citizens to be prepared to speak out plainly and clearly against things evil. The vision of the Bishop of Limerick in 1944 was gentler, of Protestantism as a precept, quote, to set our own house in order, to live hopefully in it in a neighbourly fashion, to express a method of living valuable to the state. Here is where they could have some heft, darting out now and again from their circled wagons to snatch the nation back to righteousness. But when the slightly odoriferous Catholic state could no longer be tolerated, there were other loyalties, other conceptions of citizenship that could leapfrog, bypass, or lie alongside it. In a manifestation of Neil Asherson's notion of inner emigration, the minority took to what we might describe as Protestant home rule. Prosperous Protestants withdrew into comfortable ghettos and self-imposed apartheid, although poorer Protestants were liable to be picked off by mixed marriages and emigration. The impetus principally came from class considerations and the relentless dilution of the tribe, occasioned by Catholic insistence on the children of mixed marriages being brought up as Catholics. Protestants created a Lilliputian civitas with self-governance in church, administration, health, education, and associational culture, all underpinned by prosperous Protestant firms and farms. It was quite possible to live a Protestant life and die a Protestant death without much troubling the other side, which suited the other side too. This Protestant Free State was an imagined community, seeing the polity through a different lens. It clung to the symbols, if not the substance, of Britishness, principally characterized by a rather desperate cultural royalism, as cloying as honey on treacle. While in public, remaining muted, it demonstrated a louder voice in Protestant privacy, as in Armistice Day church services, or as in 1935, with Bishop Godfrey Day of Kilkenny ordering special church celebrations for George V's Silver Jubilee. It filtered out newly painted green post boxes, seeing only the royal ciphers that remained. British coinage still circulated, even if, from 1928, the king had to slum it with the pigs and chickens on the new Irish currency. It emphasised a shared cultural heritage with Britain, quote, which I am not ashamed to regard as the finest in the world, asserted one Protestant school headmaster in 1932. This was facilitated by the continuing ease of moving between Anglo and Irish, serving in the British military and the wider imperial service. It is significant that the Irish state's Gaelicisation objectives were seen as the principal threat to this form of global citizenship through empire. If successful, wrote that same headmaster, quote, it means goodbye to the modern world. If all this seemed somewhat artificial and faintly risible, it smoothed over loss and anxiety. As Nora Robertson put it in 1960, quote, in respecting new loyalties, it had not seemed incumbent upon us to throw our old ones overboard. Such parallelism was not unique to Southern Irish Protestants. French Protestantism exhibited, and indeed still exhibits, some similar characteristics. And a study by Recca Bennett on the position of German Catholics following unification in 1871 argues that they responded to Bismarck's Kulturkampf by asserting an idea of a distinctive national singularity that ran side by side along with the official version. The Southern Protestant narrative has been largely represented as one of disengagement from the life of the Ireland around it. One fictional exception is the feisty Protestant heroine in Lennox Robinson's 1926 play, The Big House, who declares that, quote, Ireland is not more theirs than ours. We've spent so much time sympathetically seeing theirs that we've lost sight of our own. What our own might be, however, was not always clear. Faced with an unfamiliar political dispensation, Southern Protestants had to juggle with the potentially disastrous disconnect between a genuine place-based patriotism, an uneasiness with an ascendant national Catholicism, and an inherent indifference that seemed almost embedded in their DNA. In 1922, the Reverend Dudley Fletcher tried to resolve this dilemma. Quote, I am proud of my British blood and name. I allow the same privilege to my Gaelic neighbour. We both want to be proud of being Irishmen. A form of de facto shared citizenship and the ability to pick and choose allegiances, much like the Northern Ireland situation today under the Good Friday Agreement, gave room and leeway to Southern Irish Protestants for the first 25 years of the new state to find a congenial interpretation of citizenship. Building the Enlightenment concept of a res publica was further facilitated by a generational change from those who had experienced the 1922 settlement. There were some setbacks to community integration, both political and social. Child custody cases centred on the Nay Temery Decree poisoned interfaith relations in the 1950s, and there existed a sour sectarianism between some clerics. But the point about the cases was their exceptional nature, and the clerics began to see that they had darker enemies than each other. Gradually, the line on the bus began to disappear. Edna Longley remarked in 1989 that if Catholics were born Irish, Protestants had, quote, to work their passage to Irishness. I would argue that having to work that passage actually gave Protestants freedom and flexibility to construct their own sense of citizenship. They also had a more extensive a la carte menu of belongingness to draw on, ranging through a sense of patria, denominational and religious loyalties, still being part of the British and Empire worlds, and an ethical dimension to citizenship that spilled out into internationalism and what we would now call human rights. And since Protestants had to work at it, it may have made them more sensitive to the whole idea of citizenship. An academic analysis of the 1999 to 2000 European Values Study, which tested citizenship in the Republic, rather surprisingly suggested that Protestants, quote, particularly in the realm of civic morality, are closer to the ideal of the model citizen than are Catholics. From being an emigrant society, Ireland quite rapidly has become an immigrant one. There are now more Poles than Presbyterians, more Muslims than Methodists in the Republic. In the middle of Ireland's Catholic century in 1937, Irish Protestantism suggested that, quote, in its heritage, there are truths that Ireland needs. It took some time, but it can be held that notions of Irish citizenship in the late 20th and early 21st centuries have been coloured by the virtual Protestantization of Irish society in a Weberian, if not entirely a religious sense. An old examination question used to be, why did the Reformation fail in Ireland? from today's perspective, the answer now might be it didn't. It just took 450 years. Southern Protestants can perhaps be excused just a little bit of a wry smile. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Really fascinating paper. We've got a question from Farah, but I think if we carry on with our plan and save that for later, is that all right?
Yep, yeah. Fine, of course, yeah.
We'll come back to questions later, I think.
Yeah.
Because I think that there'll be a lot of discussion, I'm sure, about it. Thank you, Ian. That was really fascinating. So moving then to our second speaker this morning, I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Kate Bradley, who is Reader in Social History and Social Policy at the University of Kent. And her most recent book is Lawyers for the Poor and relates to the paper that she's about to deliver. And you might be interested to know that it's available on the Manchester University Press bookstand for the conference. So that's great. So Kate's going to talk to us about creating legal cultures, citizenship, class, and the poor man's lawyer in interwar England. So over to you, Kate.
Great, thank you, Hazel. Can you all see my slides?
Yes, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so thank you very much for coming along this morning and taking the time to listen to our papers. So what I'm talking about today draws upon research that I began when working on the Lawyers for the Poor project, where I was kind of looking at the evolution of voluntary legal advice and aid in England from the 1890s through to the 1990s. And so one of the things that has been kind of on my mind in that time, and at the moment I'm doing a kind of further kind of smaller project on this with Pip Gregory and Oliver Parkin at the University of Kent, in terms of thinking about how kind of a lot of activity around letting people know about their rights and teaching them how to kind of be citizens in the context of the 20th century in England, how we might kind of think about that in theoretical and conceptual terms. And so something I'm quite interested in is the idea of applying the concept of legal culture, which is something that I think modern and particularly contemporary social historians haven't really used. It is something that early modernists and medievalists kind of use a lot more happily, but so far it is not something that I've found modern and contemporary historians using, particularly those kind of working on periods kind of after kind of 1890 or so. And this might be something to do with what we're looking at. And I think why it's quite interesting looking at the period 1890 to 1939 is that it is a period in which there are huge changes, not only in citizenship across the four nations of Britain, for example, we're thinking about universal suffrage of men and then kind of women kind of catching up by 1928, but also major changes in the role of the state and lots of kind of legislation, for example, around health and safety, factory acts, housing, all those kinds of things. So huge changes in the relationship between the state and the individual through laws. And then in the kind of the early, just before the First World War, the introduction of kind of national insurance and pensions, for example, so those kind of things. And I suspect in many ways that when we're talking about welfare and citizenship, in many ways, as modern historians, we might be talking more about kind of legal cultures. So I think there's something about legal culture that we need to think about as kind of scholars of citizenship in its different ways. Now, legal culture, whilst it might be something that modern and contemporary social historians aren't grappling with, it has been used by many other it's been used across the social sciences and humanities. For example, there's Lawrence M. Friedman's The Republic of Choice, or Clifford Geertz as kind of local knowledge, further essays, and interpretive anthropology, in which is the examination of the relationship between law and society. And so researchers in different parts of the social sciences and humanities might conceive of legal culture in different ways and kind of use it in different forms. But I think thinking about this relationship between law and society is one that can be fruitful for us as kind of social historians. Thinking about, well, how does the law, where does it come from, and how is it applied in society today? So, sorry, my moving on didn't want to happen in the way that it moved on the previous slide for odd reasons. So I'd now like to think about, start honing in on kind of the period 1890 to 1939. Like I mentioned before, there have been big shifts in what we might describe as welfare from the mid-19th century. In addition to the laws I've kind of mentioned around kind of factories, for example, there had also been shifts in the remit of the poor law, moving from a more discretionary to a rules-based system, different ideas about how to organise voluntary action so that it might be efficient in its application. And so in some ways, what there is a bit of a gap is between, in terms of thinking about welfare history, not just thinking about, say, the institutions and the laws, but thinking about how this moved from the more discretionary poor law, which has been explored in the work of scholars like Elizabeth Huron and Stephen King and others, kind of looking at pauper letters, people writing to say why they ought to be entitled to things, to this more rules-based welfare. And this is also the kind of point at which conversations about legal culture as a concept seem to stop. Yet, what we might describe as a legal culture doesn't go away. There's certainly been, historians have explored many of the activist campaigns for things such as changes to the law around sexuality, sexually transmitted diseases, further restrictions around work, housing conditions, etc. And also, of course, the rise of tort law. But the fundamental question is, laws are great, but what if you don't know what your rights are, or if you don't have the capital, whether it's social or cultural capital, to get support with them and the ability to articulate your case? And so the image I've got here is a zooming in of like the publicity shot for publicity kind of poster for William Booth's In Darkest England and the Way Out, published in 1891, in which one of the things that the founder and leader of the Salvation Army called for was a poor man's lawyer. So In Darkest England had a massive impact on publication in 1891. One of the results of it was that then a young early career barrister called Frank Tilliard, who was a resident at Mansfield House Settlement in East London, launched a poor man's lawyer evening. So he was inspired by Booth's book and thought, well, okay, I'm a barrister, I've got legal knowledge, I'm at a settlement, I have the ability to reach out to the people of Canning Town and to offer them kind of advice on their legal matters. So this idea of a poor man's lawyer kind of began with Tilliard and other people involved at that settlement. But this kind of model of lawyers giving up their evenings to offer legal advice for free or for a very low charge kind of spread through what have been described by Moore and others as the new philanthropy of the 1890s and 1900s. So in addition to settlement houses, guilds of help, councils of social welfare, etc. So in addition to these kind of poor man's lawyer evenings popping up around the country, there's also a considerable amount of activism by women, partly through the campaigns kind of from the 1890s, wanting women to be able to join the legal profession. By the late 19th century, they could do law degrees, but they couldn't actually qualify as lawyers until the early 1920s. So those women who were so lots of women who are involved in kind of offering legal advice or advice about the law without being lawyers, through things like, for example, the forerunners of the Industrial Law Committee of the Young Women's Christian Association, that kind of offering advice mostly to women through their kind of associational culture kind of networks, but also to men as well, kind of in ways kind of acting a bit as kind of pseudo lawyers. And what they were also interested in was not only advice, but also educating people about their rights as well. And so the Industrial Law Committee in the early 1920s did a lot of work in kind of making sure that young women at work knew, for example, about national insurance and what their kind of rights and responsibilities were. What's quite significant about this, all this kind of voluntary activity into the 1920s, is that the people for whom legal advice is part of the kind of voluntary offer they have at local level merge in 1919 to create the National Council of Social Service, which is now NCVO. So they become an umbrella body that is involved in kind of thinking about what voluntary provisions should be available across the country, what it should look like in specific contexts, and what its relationship with the state, in this case local authorities, should be. So it's becoming part of their kind of idea about what an offer looks like. So the Betterton Report of 1924 was more broadly about public assistance, but it had made a key point in there about local authorities through their local branch of the Council of Social Service, the kind of like the local umbrella group for all the kind of different kind of charities that work in an area, should be providing advice to people. Either that could be legal advice, but advice on how to use public services, how to kind of negotiate the state. So, and this is also coinciding with the kind of calls for the Finlay committees, which were kind of looking at the provision of legal advice for people on low incomes. And the second one, which I mentioned here, looked at civil advice. It ended up focusing on kind of access to divorce, but there had been kind of pushes from well before that for it to kind of look more broadly at people's ability to access advice on a whole range of their rights. And it was pushed for by some of the first women magistrates, Clara Rackham, Gertrude Tuckwell, and Marion Phillips. So they didn't quite get what they want, but it's part of this kind of process of pushing for better access, in addition to people also kind of knowing about what their rights might be. So in addition to this, so not only have we got kind of new what we now call the voluntary sector kind of bodies acting a bit like a sector and saying what they want to do, we also need to be aware of another actor in the form of the BBC. So the BBC launched as a private company in 1922. In 1926, it became the corporation. And with it, the Raytheon kind of remit of informing, educating, and entertaining. And so the talks department of the BBC was an opportunity to kind of use that form to reach people with lots of information and education on their rights, as well as possibly a bit of education. And particularly with the economic downturn from 1929, there became particular impetus for the BBC to be involved in trying to not only kind of relieve the tedium and anxiety of people who were out of work for long periods of time, but also to try and educate people on their rights. And in 1932, Ramsay MacDonald's government did approach the BBC, the NCSS, to help them kind of get them kind of coordinating activities for the unemployed. So we get a lot of kind of movement between the NCSS and the BBC kind of cooperating on things. The person in the image here is Professor John Hilton, who was a professor of industrial relations at the University of Cambridge and also connected with mass observation as well. He did a series of key talks from kind of 1933, such as This Way Out, and also had newspaper columns in the News Chronicle, in which he kind of talked about like addressing people's legal rights, their entitlements to different kinds of welfare. Richard Clements in 1935 had a series called Question Time for the Unemployed, 12 radio broadcasts where the public wrote in for questions for him on their rights, and they would be answered by NCSS staff. So kind of offering a mix of practical help, education by proxy, and also kind of advertising the role of the NCSS. And to give an idea of the popularity, in the first week of this, Clements had 1,500 letters written into the BBC. This was also attracting the attention not only of the NCSS, but also groups like the YWCA, and a lot of interest in what were kind of emerging ideas kind of built from the Betterton report of what the Citizens Advice Bureau, eventually launched in 1939, could be and what it could look like. And again, some of the things that come through in this, they are often, this is a cover image of a book published kind of in relation to one of the broadcast series in this period. But again, not only kind of like bringing to life the experience of unemployment and kind of social need for middle class public, such as here, we've got, what is your profession? Are you a lawyer? Your help in elucidating the laws about unemployment and benefit and rent restriction and so on could be of inestimable help if you could spare the local club an hour a week. So not only an illumination, but a call to action. But again, an interest in thinking across different forms, radio, newspapers, and also publications about rights, and the real interest of the BBC and their producers at this point in time in trying to offer this kind of support to the public. So some conclusions to kind of pull this together. So, I mean, well, starting a conclusion with the question, I think it's useful to think about legal culture in the context of kind of welfare in the first half of the 20th century, and particularly thinking about what might be kind of happening here if legal culture, where it is perhaps being done by new professions, so kind of broadcasting being a new profession, social work emerging as a profession through those kind of networks I kind of mentioned, but also increasingly new people in professions, so, well, women mainly, and how this might be shifting the parameters, and maybe the language might be changed. It might be contemporaries and then, and kind of since then, might be thinking less about lawyers doing things, but more that this is kind of talk about rights and responsibilities and citizenship, which is often about the law and legal matters, but kind of moving it into a different area. And I suppose it is important for us to kind of think about, if we're thinking about culture and its relationship between, in this case, between law and society, thinking about where the manifestations might be, what kind of optimism there might be about kind of using new media in order to kind of educate people, and the way in which we might kind of see these kind of attempts to build up new understandings from people via kind of new ways of organising, voluntary action, but also kind of thinking about the technologies available. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you. That was really, really interesting and impeccably timed. Both speakers so far are doing incredibly well on that. I find that very difficult myself. Okay, thank you very, very much. So we'll save up our questions for Kate and of course all the other speakers at the end. So we're going to move on now to our third speaker of this morning, Dr. Eureka Heinrich, who is Senior Lecturer in History at the University of Hertfordshire. Her most recent book is an edited collection on migrant, multicultural and diasporic heritage, which is part of Routledge's series on key issues in cultural heritage. So Eureka is going to talk to us this morning about medical aid free to all immigrants, the Migrant Medical Centre in Sydney's King's Cross, and the paradox of Australia's post-war immigration programme. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Hazel.
Thank you.
I'll see if I can do the same thing as everyone else and be impeccably timed.
No pressure.
Can you see my screen here?
Yes.
Okay, fabulous. We'll go from the beginning. And just good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming along to the panel, which I've really been enjoying so far, particularly because I've been on maternity leave for the last 6 months. So this conference is a great opportunity to reconnect with the world of research. It just feels a bit odd to be home, and just a little caveat, I do have a 5-year-old self-isolating because her school bubble's out. So we'll see how we go with interruptions. And my own research focuses on intersections between ideas about health and migration, and particularly how those ideas informed Australia's post-war immigration program. Now, many of you may be familiar with this through the idea of the £10 POMs, which is one of the main schemes. But this period was actually a huge recruitment drive in which almost 3 million migrants and refugees came to Australia in the 3 decades following the Second World War. Over half of those new arrivals were non-British migrants, and this is the first time in Australia's history that they were actively sought as potential citizens. Images of those new Australians, as they were called in government speak, were used to help sell the idea of mass migration to a sceptical public. Newsreels and media releases depicted good-looking, often fair-haired, muscular and beautiful types, with their physical fitness suggesting their fitness as potential citizens. Health was also a major theme in the promotion of Australia overseas to potential British and European immigrants. And I've got an example here. Pamphlets and posters like this one promised a full, healthy life down under. And one information booklet that was circulated to potential British migrants claimed that Australia is one of the healthiest countries in the world. So the point here is that health was a sell that worked both ways. It was a sell for existing citizens to accept new arrivals and to potential citizens to try and get them to Australia. And it's the relationship between this government image of healthy new citizens and the actual experiences and memories of those navigating Australia's health systems in this period that's at the crux of my research. In this paper, I'd like to introduce just one case study that began with an unexpected discovery in the archives. One of those moments where you find something and think, oh, here's a new rabbit hole. And this is what I found, this particular image. It captures a consultation between a patient and a medical specialist in Sydney in 1961. And the caption that you can see here reads, "A team of medical specialists in Sydney, New South Wales, voluntarily give hours of their time to assist ill newcomers to Australia at the Migrant Medical Centre, King's Cross. The 11 doctors, who speak 10 languages between them, cover almost every branch of medicine, from psychiatry to gynecology and internal diseases. A newcomer from Europe discusses his injured foot with one of the specialists at the centre." Now, this is an official photograph that was taken for the Department of Immigration, and I think it gives us an impression of a well thought through, cohesive health service that perhaps meshes philanthropic volunteerism with state provision, and which caters to the needs of new arrivals. But my astonishment in finding this image was because this kind of specialised free service is about as far from the norm in this post-war period as possible. Mental and physical health was a crucial area of the migrant experience, which in many cases caused great hardship, financially, emotionally, and socially. And other sources that I've examined for this project, including oral history testimony and the writings of medical professionals, attest to those experiences and the lack of services like this one. At a time when the prevailing government doctrine for migrants was assimilation, and people were expected to learn English almost as soon as they arrived. How did a centre like this come into existence? And a question for me was, why has it been hidden in histories of Australia's post-war immigration program ever since? And maybe a further question, I think, is there something that we can learn from this kind of service today? Well, the Migrants Medical Centre was entirely absent from the secondary literature. So I was excited and relieved to find that there was a file on it held by the Department of Immigration in Canberra, which is Australia's capital city. This file, which you can see on the slide, allowed me to piece together the beginnings of the centre. Correspondence between Commonwealth migration officers in Sydney and the department's assimilation section in Canberra reveal a keen interest in the Migrant Medical Centre and who was involved in it. and it includes newspaper clippings and accounts of telephone conversations. So this is the story that I've been able to piece together from the file. In mid-1960, the department was contacted by a Dr. A. Roller, and he asked for, and I quote, some official recognition of the necessity or desirability of a migrant medical centre. Kearns, who was a Commonwealth Migration Officer in Sydney, began to collect background information on this doctor, Dr. Roller. And here I've just laid out on a slide all the different players in this story, because I know that gets a little bit confusing when you're hearing lots of different unfamiliar organisations and actors. So we've got this Commonwealth Migration Officer, Mr. Kearns in Sydney, who's trying to figure out who this doctor is and what's going on. He begins by contacting the Sydney branch of the British Medical Association, and an assistant secretary there, Dr. Larking, told him that they were aware of the proposed centre and were, and I quote, not mad about it. Larking suggested that Kearns contact Mr. Dudley Marsh. He was the director of the Commonwealth Bank's Migrant Information Service. Now, in an odd twist, it is a bank and not a government department. That was the pioneer of translation and migrant advice in Australia. So the bank developed advice services in all major cities and regional centres. And of course, they benefited from the business of migrants who they needed services, banking services and loans, and they actually underpinned an economic boom in the years to come. So it turned out that Marsh had been approached to become a patron of the centre. So he had the inside scoop and was able to provide Kearns with the names of all the people who were involved. After making further inquiries, he established that the centre had been initially proposed by representatives of Sydney's Italian and Greek communities, spearheaded by the editors of the Hellenic Herald and La Fiamma, these are community language newspapers, as well as local Italian businesses and a local church. He was also able to confirm that this Dr. Roller had arrived as a stateless migrant in 1950. He'd been a medical student at Sydney University and then naturalised in 1955. His conclusion at this point was that the centre was unlikely to function without the support of the BMA, and he thought that was unlikely to be forthcoming. Now, I think Kearns's hunch here was certainly well placed. Further discussions with the BMA documented in this file reveal attitudes that typify the Anglo-Australian medical establishment's approach to migrant doctors in this period. Dr. Hunter, who was the secretary of the BMA branch, told Kearns that his organisation would have to, quote, give very serious consideration to the qualifications of so-called specialists, and that in his experience, there were certain standards in Australia which were higher than some standards in European countries. So casting into doubt the qualifications of non-British migrant doctors was ironic, because these doctors were forced to retake their qualifications in Australia. So they were in fact doubly qualified. And there are instances documented in the historic record of doctors being taught from textbooks that they themselves had authored. The attitudes of the BMA also indicate a profound misunderstanding of the experiences of many migrants to Australia. The secretary, Dr. Hunter, acknowledged to Kearns that, quote, in the early years of post-war migration, migrants had great difficulty in consulting medical practitioners because of the language situation. But now that the program had been running for so many years, the difficulty was no longer very great. So there's this idea that, that everyone just learns English now and it's no big deal. Well, despite all of these hurdles and the reservations of the BMA, the persistence of the founders of the centre paid off. And in early 1960, we have this article appearing in the press, Migrants Get Own Clinic. Over the next year, they managed to raise funds to hire a secretary who spoke 8 languages, hire some space in King's Cross, which is very close to the city in Sydney. It's walking distance for people. And they kitted out the centre for opening. They also managed to recruit patrons from both sides of politics and to attract donations, including £500 from the Migrant Information Service. So they obviously recognised a need for this service and wanted to be able to refer people to it. There is the question of how they managed to get around the suspicions of the BMA, and I suspect that the BMA may have been placated by the assurance that the centre would provide mainly diagnostic services, and that any patients referred to them for diagnosis could then be returned back to their GP for treatment. And this effectively protected their ability to charge a fee for service. So we don't have an NHS in Australia in this period, far from it. And what kind of underpins the medical profession is this ability to charge a fee for service. When the centre was opened, a vice president of it, who was also the editor of an Italian language newspaper, Mr. Costanzo, explained its purpose to the press. And he said, many migrants who found it difficult to describe their illnesses in English would be able to consult doctors at the clinic in their own language. Many of them suffered health disturbances through unemployment and insecurity. These factors combined to make the sick migrant feel isolated in the community. And what we can see here is advertised consultation hours and clinics at the opening of the centre. And you can see they're busy all week long. Okay, so what about the Department of Immigration? Did they end up getting behind this initiative and lending their support? Well, in the weeks following the centre's opening, there is a note in the file from Cairns, this Commonwealth Migration Officer, and he says he's going to visit Dr. Roller at the centre to determine whether it was indeed bona fide. If so, he wrote, they could refer to it migrants who call at this branch, particularly those who appear to have nervous disorders, who cannot pay specialists' fees and who cannot obtain the treatment they require at the psychiatric clinics at one or two of our major metropolitan hospitals. So this is an interesting admission that actually there is a need for such a centre. And I suspect that because it was useful, it was tolerated by the department, if not explicitly supported. Now, less than a year later, the Migrant Medical Centre surfaces in the press again. The cause was a crisis with funding, which meant that the centre was likely to close if they couldn't find extra support. And the Daily Mirror, a Sydney newspaper, championed the cause. They asked Commonwealth and state health authorities, so we have these two levels of health authorities in Oz, what they proposed to do to keep this centre open. The Federal Minister for Health, Senator Wade, maintained that existing public services were adequate and efficient. He pointed to clinics and hospitals in migrant hostels and accommodation centres, and also pointed to multilingual people working in hospitals, and said that new migrants are not likely to suffer in this country for want of medical care. So that's from the Department of Health. A spokesperson from the Department of Immigration said, we feel that the centre may be a matter for the New South Wales health authorities. And the New South Wales health authorities, represented by the Minister, Mr. Sheehan, said that it is the Commonwealth Government that should keep the centre open. So the responses reveal buck passing between departments at different levels, and no one wanting to actually cough up some money to help. The debate also surfaced some serious criticism of the immigration program. Mr. Lander, who is a patron of the centre and a Labor politician, so he's on the left side of politics in Australia, struck out at Senator Wade, who's on the other side of politics, to a journalist. So this is all happening, this debate in the papers. And he said, it's no good saying to migrants that hospitals have nurses or non-medical staff members who can act as interpreters. The sick and injured migrant is like anyone else. He wants to speak directly to a doctor in his own language and explain his symptoms. While vast amounts of money were spent bringing migrants to Australia, Lander asked, without adequate support in terms of employment, health and housing, quote, is it any wonder so many migrants pack up and go home? This is as far as I've been able to trace the story of the Migrants Medical Centre through this one file. And it does not appear that the centre survived, at least not in its original form. So I'll just draw this to a close. Other historians have noted the paradox of Australia's postal immigration program. And this was that an ideology of assimilation and cultural homogeneity actually sowed the seeds for the cultural diversity, which is today celebrated as a national strength. One sec. You have to wait a couple minutes, my love.
I finished. What do I do now?
You can pick one more thing to watch.
Yeah, I'll pick another movie.
Okay, my darling.
Yeah, I can watch another movie.
One more. So this is this paradox, which is widely recognised. You know, no one wanted to end white Australia, but actually in attracting a wider group of migrants, the perceived cultural homogeneity of the country began to change. The case study that I've introduced today offers us another insight. It's a small example of a volunteer-run migrant health service, but it's evidence of this other paradox that the government was not willing to confront. The healthy new citizens that they had screened and recruited came with their own health needs that could not simply be met by existing services. The very fact that the centre got going as a cooperative endeavour between Sydney's Italian and Greek communities, driven by the leadership of a very determined refugee doctor enroller, who I suspect is the doctor pictured here in this photograph, indicates the seriousness of the health problem across migrant groups. What we have here is a radical anti-establishment organisation that managed to provide a free service at a time when self-help and voluntary insurance underpinned health systems in Australia. And I think it resisted that fiction of near instant cultural assimilation. In the flurry of criticism that accompanied its financial crisis in 1962, it also established a new discourse in migrant health. Rather than troublesome patients who had failed to assimilate, mainstream newspapers claimed the right of migrants to access healthcare in their own language. Australia's healthcare systems have come a long way since the 1960s, but the rights of non-citizens to access healthcare, particularly those who've been detained by the state, are still at risk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eureka. That was so interesting. Absolutely fascinating case study, and a very professionally handled mini interruption as well.
I always figure it can't be as bad as that BBC one where the kid walks in. So.
No, that was ideal. It was absolutely fabulous. Okay, thank you. I'm sure we'll have more discussion a little bit later. So for our final paper of this panel, I'm delighted to be introducing Dr. Pharah Mendelsohn, who is best known for her work on science fiction and fantasy. And this paper on constructing citizenship, fiction and the wars of the three kingdoms is based on a recent book, Creating Memory, Historical Fiction and the English Civil War. And there's a paperback coming out for that next year. So looking forward to going a little bit further back in history for this paper. Shall I hand over to you now, Farah?
Thank you very much. Let me just get this up and then play from start. Okay, so this is going to be a much less dense paper than everybody else's. It's based on a book that came out this year. So had I given this paper last year as I was supposed to have done, it would have been a work in progress, instead of which it's essentially talking about just an element of something that came out of it. And I just want to explain quickly that the common term these days for this particular conflict in the middle of the 17th century is the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. But it became horribly obvious when we were talking particularly to American readers that most people didn't actually know what that was. And actually, I was quite lucky if they knew we'd had a civil war in the UK. It was extremely common for people to actually look at me and say, you had a civil war too? So that's why the conflict of titles. So I just want to talk about the project, and this isn't working. Oh, there we go. Why the English Civil War? Politics, passion and presentism, and there's a comma missing there. This is one of the few parts of English history where people still have passionate engagement with the actual events of the Civil War. An awful lot of our modern politics really descend from this period. Behind me, I've got a poster that you can get in Manchester's Labour History Museum, which traces the origins of the Chartist movement in the English Civil War. Many of our Protestant denominations, Quakers in particular, but also Methodists and Baptists, are first seen during this period and consolidate in the Restoration. And a lot of the way our constitution works, to the degree we have one, was established in the Bill of Rights in 1689, which was a direct result of the fall of the House of Stuart, which where you end the Civil War really does depend on how you understand what's going on. And it particularly became an issue during Brexit, where an awful lot of cartoons on both sides fought for the right to be seen as the winning side within the English Civil War. And that meant that it wasn't necessarily predictable which side identified themselves with Parliament, which side identified themselves with royalists. But the consequence is that people care what side is put forward in the English Civil War in a way they don't with other periods. With other periods, you tend to get much more nuanced approaches when things are written for children. With this one, things very much take sides. And one of the things I looked at as part of the project was children's history books. I looked at A School History of Children by Rudyard Kipling, which was extremely successful. It sold something like 500,000 copies. This is a much more left-wing one, an outline for boys and girls and their parents, which was produced, I think, by H.G. Wells and various other people and caused huge controversy. And this is the one that I first came across when I was 8 years old in class, and which my entire history of the English Civil War was apparently built on, despite the fact it only has about 2 pages, if that. There's also children's popular history. Some of you will have come across Our Island Story, which is actually pro-parliamentarian, which might surprise you. And Oliver Cromwell, A Ladybird history book, which many of you may have older members of the audience will have come across, and again tends to be very pro-parliament. And Horrible Histories, Slimy Stewart's by Terry Deary, which is actually pro-royalist, essentially because it sees the royalists as being fun and Parliament as being boring. And it's not really that way, but we won't go into that today. The actual project, I ended up with 187 titles, starting with Daniel Defoe's Memoirs of a Cavalier from 1720, a gap in the 1990s when this goes right out of fashion, and then rather a lot of contemporary titles from the past decade or so. I ended up not looking at the sequels. And a very key question early on was, how do these books pan out? Are they for the king? Are they for Parliament? Are they neutral? And it's actually about 50-50, because most of the neutral texts still lean towards Parliament for reasons I'm going to discuss. It's about citizenship. This is just some of the fiction, but these are some of the books that I ended up spending most time on because they were most useful. Captain Marryat's Children of the New Forest, which many of you will have read. Henty's Friends Though Divided, which is a lot less royalist than his reputation would suggest. Under the Storm by Charlotte M. Young, which is very high Anglican and therefore pro-royalist, and I'll try to talk about that. And then just along the bottom, some modern ones, which are my absolute favourites. Silver Guard by Geoffrey Trees and Simon by Rosemary Sutcliffe, which are both pro-parliamentarian. For the King by Ronald Welch, which is for the king, but again, I'll come to that. And Anne Turnbull's Alice in Love and War, which is neutral but leans Parliament. And this is just some background on the shifts in the decades, because I started to become interested in where things lent when. And consistently, the king wins out, but there are real peaks in parliamentary support at the end of the 19th century, which is essentially after Thomas Carlyle published Oliver Cromwell's letters, and Cromwell's reputation just changes almost overnight from being a very stupid tyrant to being somebody people really start to respect. And if you're Irish, I apologize, that's a whole extra argument. And then if you look around 2010, on the right-hand side, you'll see we've got an even split of king and parliament, but that Parliament and neutral is actually creeping ahead, and I think that mattered. One of the issues that started to come up was the issue of duty versus rebellion. And by this, what I meant is duty to family and traditional loyalties and rebellion against one's family and therefore the king, because the two can be found pretty much. I'm just going to stop screen sharing for a minute. running in parallel. And it's that I want to talk about relatively briefly. But the first thing I want to say is that all of these books are essentially expressly didactic. They're knowledge dense, and they aim to teach about the conflict, the culture, and the warfare. And they're all propaganda, even the neutral ones. They're there to make a point. And what I really need you to do is to divorce both the words didactic and the words propaganda from all the negative connotations you've all probably been brought up on. We tend to make assumptions about what those words mean that I personally find really problematic. These authors, many of whom are some of our best children's writers over 200 years, are out to convince children of something. One issue there is that the plots are often just scaffolding for the things they're trying to teach. There are very few of these books that have complicated plots. They're all essentially about somebody leaving home to either fight for the king or fight for Parliament, or they're about the impact of the war on the home front. That's particularly true of books after the 1940s. But the other factor here is that in writing these books, they wanted to grow a particular kind of child. And that division centers around the issue of loyalty and citizenship. For this period, they're completely different things, because the loyal child is the king's subject. The citizen child is the maker of the parliamentary future. And they're very, very distinct. In most of the books, there's no such thing as ambiguous loyalty. To be neutral is to lean to Parliament. And as I've already suggested, if you add the neutral text to this, then almost half the texts are not supportive of the king to one degree or the other. Most of these texts, up until the 1950s and 60s, boys, because it's mostly boys, there are a few exceptions, but I don't have time to talk about those, follow their fathers into whatever their fathers' loyalties are. And that ties up very clearly with another shift that takes place in the 1950s, where in books before the 1950s, boys' careers are mostly decided by their parents or by what their father does. If their father was a doctor, they become a doctor. The 1950s is also the period of career books, because children are no longer following their fathers into particular careers, therefore they need advice. There's a very real parallel. Up to the 50s, children do what their fathers did in terms of loyalty. The exception is almost entirely the American books, which tend to come from Northeastern Protestants, and at least one chap I'm pretty sure is a Quaker. There's a slight difference between Protestants and Quakers on this one for various reasons. And it's true of left-wing writers as much as right-wing writers, so it's not necessarily a left-right shift. But there is a difference between the way in which this is expressed, in that the more right-wing writers tend to be more clear that to be critical is in and of itself dangerous and problematic. So the middle-of-the-road writers like Captain Marryat, loyalty to the king is inherited in the blood. Sorry, I just want to skip over very quickly. In Philemore's The King's Namesake, loyalty is by its very nature unthinking. There's a good quote here from Westerman from The Young Cavalier in 1911. Arthur Harcourt was a royalist in the truest acception of the word. He would never have dreamed of questioning his sovereign's command. It's only an author like Jane Lane, who is extremely right-wing, writing in the 1930s and quite clearly using the whole thing as a parallel for the Spanish Civil War, which I actually wrote my PhD on, so there's a connection there in my past work, where we see people actually arguing for royalism against Protestantism as being wrong-headed. And then we tend to see arguments about the Bible, about the hierarchy of beings, about the way the world should be organized. But that really is an exception. Generally speaking, pro-royalist books have, as Jerome de Groot has noted, a monosemic view of the world in which you have single truths, single behaviors, and loyalty and subjecthood is very much a given. Why this is so interesting is because the pro-Parliament books take such a very different approach. And here it's worth being aware that there's been some research done in who wrote children's books in the late 18th and early 19th century, and they are disproportionately dissenters. The English, and I do mean English here, tradition of children's literature comes out of the dissenting tradition. And although there is no direct link between Methodism and the English Civil War, there is a slightly indirect link in that one of the very earliest founders of Methodism was actually the grandson of Cromwell's chaplain. So you can trace these narrative links. And generally speaking, dissenting writers are far more likely to be pro-Parliament. This is a slight segue, but I had to explain to a fiction author that if she called her child Oliver in 1970, she was either a character. She was either telling me that the character was from a dissenting tradition or that they were from a socialist family, because the name carried so much weight. I'm drifting again. Although parliamentarian texts do tend to send sons after fathers, we tend to get scenes in these books in which fathers discuss with their sons why they're on the parliamentary side. One of the most interesting books in my collection from the 1860s is by Elizabeth Rundle Charles, The Draytons and the Davenants. And this is a classic families divided text. And that's a very, very common plot for these books. And the book is just full of discussions as to why people are taking different sides. And she's actually unusual in that she gives discussion into the mouths of the royalists as well. They often talk about their religion, they talk about their loyalty. But the point is, it's a discussed position. This is true of Hester Burton's Kate Ryder, where the eldest son actually becomes a royalist. And his position is discussed in pushback against what his father and what the minister is saying. This means that there's quite a significant overlap in these books with intergenerational tension and intergenerational duty, so that I wasn't totally surprised that the periods in which rebellion appears more often than familial duty are the 1920s, the 1970s, and the 2010s. And the first two in particular are very much periods when we're aware of intergenerational tensions in society. The fictions writing about the English Civil War reflect that. One of the areas where this is also expressed is whenever in any of these texts there is a step parent. It's quite common, for example, a good example here is Winifred Corley's Down the Long Stairs, where the step parent has a different political opinion than the family into which they marry into. The children rebel against that. And it's far more common for that step parent to be parliamentarian than to be royalist, for the children to be royalist. And that's interesting because the actual construction of Charles I's rhetoric in the war was very much as a familial father of the country looking after his family. And in fact, it's one of the ways in which he justifies not consulting his decisions, the whole way he rules. Would a father consult his family? No, he would not, therefore the king should not. So when the books are structured in this way, they actually mirror the kind of constitutional settlement that the king is seeking, but which Parliament, as the fractious children, are rebelling against. So the books mirror that kind of issue. What I can't talk about here, but which you might want to ask questions about, is two other aspects. And one of this is the role of friendship and the whole friends divided theme, because one of the other common plots is two friends on opposite sides of the war. And it's very interesting that this plot appears at the end of the 19th century and becomes dominant in the 20th century up to the 1970s, because what it seems to be reflecting or responding to is a mood in this country about middle ground politics, conciliation, and to a great extent, politics emerging as a game rather than as something deadly serious. That those texts of Friends Divided disappear as politics in the UK start to become a lot more fractious, I think is actually quite important. And the other thing that's overwhelmingly missing from these novels, which I found fascinating, you only find it in the work of somebody like Elizabeth Rundle Charles or the High Anglican Charlotte M. Young, is religion as a deep and meaningful aspect of citizenship that is overwhelmingly put to one side and just ignored by the writers writing from the end of the 19th century through the 20th. And again, I think that's very much a reflection of what's going on in society and the deliberate downplaying of religious differences. And I will pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. Really, really interesting, fascinating methodology, and so many themes raised. 15 minutes isn't long enough, is it? Really.
There's a book.
There's a whole book. I think all of you have got books, haven't you? So
yes.
I think, yes. Everybody needs longer than 15 minutes. Thank you so much for your paper, Farah. Thank you to all of our speakers this morning for their papers. I think we've had a really stimulating series of papers around this theme of constructing citizenship, and so many different ways of thinking about that, and ways in which it is constructed. Certainly started me thinking over anew. I'd just like to thank everyone for coming. I'd obviously particularly like to thank our speakers. And yeah, thank you very much. It's been great.